Thank you very much, Alex. And thank you everyone for coming in your lunch break. I hear there's been some fantastic sessions here, and I'm sure this one will also be lots of food for thought, no pun intended, of course. So I work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, where I'm a research director of the Food Systems Research Group. And today I'll be talking on all issues around how we can tackle food security and some of the sustainable food issues related to climate change and other big sustainability challenges. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting here today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And also to acknowledge their some 60,000 years of connection to their food systems, to sustaining their food systems without needing concepts like decarbonisation and circular economy, because of an intrinsic connection between food and Mother Earth. Connection to land, to country, to community, and to culture. For those of you who don't know about the Institute for Sustainable Futures and haven't been along to some of the other Chapter for the Goals where our colleagues have presented, we're one of the research institutes here at UTS, and we're essentially like a non-profit consultancy / think tank. And we have core areas related to sustainability, as you can see here. And we partner with government and industry and community groups to deliver these research projects. And our mission is to create change towards sustainable futures. And we have over 120 staff across many, many disciplines that we collaborate together to deliver these. And I'm from the Food Systems Research Group, as I mentioned, which sits within the Resource Stewardship Group. And I'd particularly like to thank and acknowledge today our director, Professor Stuart White, who you may know, and my colleague Melita Jazbek, who I've collaborated with very closely on some of the research that I'm going to present today. So let's just dive right in and start with cows, shall we? So if cows were a country, they would actually be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world after China and the United States. It's very significant, and tying for that position is the Republic of Food Waste as well. And while that is quite significant in terms of the emissions from both those sectors, what it also tells us is those are two of the biggest levers in the food system to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in this country, in agriculture, and for the planet. So why are we here focusing on the food systems today? So, of course, we know that food security is the second Sustainable Development Goal. And essentially, food security is about ensuring that all people at all times have access to affordable, nutritious, safe and desirable food anywhere in the world. And the idea of a food system is somewhat bigger than food security because it's about everything that's involved in getting food from nature all the way through to our dinner plate and beyond. And it includes all the interlinked sectors and actors that are involved in growing, harvesting, processing, packaging, transporting, selling, retailing, and eating food. And of course, how we manage all of that food waste and sanitation too, because all the nutrients we eat in our food come out our other end, in our wee and our poo. And it's also, the food system is linked very closely and intrinsically to the environment, to the economy, and many other sectors like the energy sector, and we'll touch on some of these. In Australia, the food system is incredibly important. It's a huge contributor not only to the economy, but to employment and to our export industries, because we not only deliver food and for the best part, food security to Australians, but also 3 times our population in the region as well. Despite the food system being vital for our very survival, the current path that we're on is not working. It's not okay, and we need to change that trajectory, because at the moment, the costs of the food system to the environment, to public health, to our well-being is greater than the benefits we're getting from the system. So we need to change. We know that the food system is under a lot of pressure. We know that food insecurity is not just an issue that affects the world. You know, we know a third of people are moderately or severely food insecure, but even in this country, and we often don't talk about it enough, that 10%, sometimes up to 30%, particularly in the post-COVID, post-pandemic era. We're seeing a lot of food insecure people with rising, and sustained costs of food, the housing crisis, etc. And we need to acknowledge that we have a problem in this country and that we can and need to address it. We also know at the same time we're wasting about a third of our food, and we also have an epidemic of obesity, diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. And these have been on the rise since the Industrial Revolution, but particularly in the past decade or two, it's really been ramped up and causing huge issues for public health. And we know, of course, that climate change is having a huge impact, whether we're talking about more frequent and extreme droughts and floods and the diseases that are coming along with that, the impact that that's having on crop yields across the country and the world, on farmer livelihoods, on food prices and on hunger is extreme, and certainly alone a reason enough that we need to transform the food system. And we also know that increasingly, because of a globalised food system, we're very vulnerable to the geopolitical situations which are happening in the far side of the world, such as Russia's war in Ukraine has had a huge impact on supply chains around the world, including agriculture in this country, and other resource scarcity issues, which I'm going to touch upon shortly. And we also know that the food system, in turn, is having a huge impact and putting pressure back on the planet. And actually, agriculture is one of the biggest single sectors impacting the planet adversely. Despite, the essentiality, of course, of our food system and food security, we need to do things differently. We know they're having a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions, on deforestation and habitat loss, on biodiversity loss. I think today we have around 95% of all mammals on the planet, excluding humans, are actually livestock, not wild animals. And water pollution and scarcity. Agriculture uses about 70% of our water, putting huge water stress, whether we're talking about in Africa or India or Australia, and water scarcity. Not to mention pollution, such as nutrient pollution from running off agricultural fields and wastewater that's been incorrectly managed, leading to algal blooms and potentially dead zones around the world. And we're seeing an increase in zoonotic diseases, whether we're talking about COVID or influenza or measles. Many of these diseases have come to the human population from the domestication of animals, and particularly animal agriculture. So we need to be really mindful about those risks and how we can better manage them, in addition to antimicrobial resistance, which is a huge global public health issue that we need to address. And we've got some excellent expertise, UTS, working on those issues, because about 80% of antibiotic use in the world is used for livestock, and it's used prophylactically, so to prevent disease. And that is dramatically increasing the antimicrobial resistance that we're now seeing around the world. But the good news is there are many, many opportunities to build a resilient food system, and it's one of the reasons why I love working where I love at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, because there's so many opportunities in working with industry and communities and policymakers and farmers to identify what are these win-win opportunities that we can tap to address all of these issues. So we don't get too overwhelmed, let's just zero in on two moderate challenges. Climate change, of course, you've heard of. And some of you may not have heard of the phosphorus security challenge, which we'll touch upon. In terms of climate change, we know we have these national climate targets that Australia has signed on to. We have committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050 and by 43% in 5 years, in 2030. We've also signed on to the voluntary global methane pledge, because obviously methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, and there's a lot of action that can be taken there. And we've pledged to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% by 2020, and a lot of that the opportunities will be in the livestock sector. But while Australia has made really, really significant progress towards our climate targets, and particularly through investment in renewable energy and energy efficiency, we're actually not going to meet our targets unless we reduce greenhouse gas emissions dramatically in the food system as well. Because what most people don't know is that the food system globally contributes around 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions. But in this country, that's more like 40%. And we don't often hear about this, and we're not having the same kind of public conversations about transitioning to net zero in agriculture as we do in other sectors like the energy sector and the transport sector. So we need to be having that conversation here too. And actually a quarter or potentially up to a third of those greenhouse gas emissions are not just on farm in agriculture, so not just from tractors and managing manure and livestock burping, but also before the upstream from the agriculture and downstream. So upstream could be around fertiliser production, or downstream, of course, relates to food waste and other energy uses. One of the reasons that we haven't heard so much about the huge impact that the food system's having on greenhouse gas emissions, and hence all the opportunities we can invest in now to reduce those, is because the way the IPCC categorises and accounts for emissions across the economy is divided into 4 main sectors: land use, energy, industry and waste. But actually food system related emissions cuts across all of those. So it's sort of hidden in all of those. We know that the emissions, as I mentioned, come across the entire food value chain, and you probably can't see the tiny detail, but in the colour you can see the different parts of the value chain, and down here you've got different types of, is there a pointer? Different types of food. And what we can see here is that animal-based foods are far more emissions intensive than plant-based foods, so above this line, and beef in particular. And actually this study doesn't even show the consumption-related emissions, which would extend all of these lines a little bit further out this way. So we now have this concept, which many of you would have heard of, called planetary boundaries, to help us understand on a global scale, how do we as humans continue to operate in what we're calling a safe operating space for humanity. And that's depicted here in the green inner circle against 9 key planetary boundaries related to climate change and biodiversity and water, etc. Unfortunately, the latest analysis assessment has shown that we've exceeded the safe levels for 6 of these boundaries, including climate change and including biogeochemical flows, which is basically phosphorus and nitrogen, because those nutrients or elements are fundamental building blocks to all life, whether we're talking about fish or cows or humans or bacteria. None of us would exist without phosphorus and nitrogen. You all know about oxygen and hydrogen and carbon, but we don't talk enough about phosphorus and nitrogen and the vital role that they play. So scientists have recommended some thresholds because we're talking about climate change and phosphorus security now. 350 parts per million in the atmosphere for carbon dioxide. And for phosphorus, there's been some suggestions that perhaps we should limit the amount of phosphorus fertiliser use going from fertilisers to soil to under 6.2 million tonnes per annum. So let's dig a bit deeper into phosphorus security for those who aren't familiar with this issue. So, as I mentioned, phosphorus is essential, fundamental building block to all life and essential for food production. So every single farmer in the world needs access to phosphorus to grow the food that we eat. Yet we have just 5 countries that control around 83% of the world's remaining phosphate rock. And if you just think about that for a second and compare that to something like water, if 5 countries in the world controlled the world's water resources, this would be a top issue of national security on every country. Yet it's not, and we don't hear about it enough. So you probably can't see there, we have Morocco controls the lion's share, about 68% of all the world's remaining high-grade phosphate rock, including in Western Sahara, which they currently occupy. You also have Egypt, China, Tunisia and Russia in the top 5. So what this means is that whether we're talking about Australia, India, Africa, Europe, we're all dependent on imports and hence vulnerable to supply disruptions and price spikes. And as recently as 2 years ago, we had a 400% price spike of phosphate rock, which had huge ramifications for Australian farmers, for Indian farmers, for farmers all the way around the world. And we didn't know that supply disruption was going to happen. That one was because China at the moment is the major producer and exporter of phosphate rock in the world annually, but most of their phosphate mines are in the Hubei province, which is the epicenter of the COVID pandemic. So there were naturally supply chain disruptions there, and that had global ramifications. Surprisingly, Australia is actually the world's 5th largest importer of phosphate, despite our tiny population. And that's because we've invested heavily in phosphate-intensive export industries like wheat and dairy and livestock, etc. But we have really naturally phosphorus-deficient soils, so we need a lot of phosphorus to add to our soils. They're ancient and weathered like African soils. So if we were going to do things differently a couple of hundred years ago, we may have changed that. But the good news is there is a lot that we can do, but what will work in Australia is not the solutions that they're trialling in the US or Japan or Europe or other countries. Oops. So given there's actually no national or global formal targets for phosphorus security, unlike climate change and energy and other key resources, we need to think, how can we feed the world potentially with investing in phosphorus efficiency and recycling? Because let's start to talk about what we can do. So that black line shows the business as usual future demand for phosphorus to feed the planet, and the red shows we've currently relied on mined phosphate rock, but we're going to have to diversify away from that. I didn't mention that's also a non-renewable finite resource, like fossil fuels, has the same story, same narrative as fossil fuels as well. So the good news is we can fill that very large gap through a portfolio of investing in a lot of different sustainability measures. And again, you don't have to be able to read it from the back, but just the blue wedges show how we can invest in doing things more efficiently to reduce the global demand for phosphorus. Because phosphorus is one of the most inefficient value chains in the world. Of the 80% of the phosphate rock that we mine, specifically for food production, ends up wasted or lost, a lot of it ending up in our waterways causing nutrient pollution. So if we can be more efficient with that 80% loss, we can do a lot better and avert a crisis. So we can be more efficient in agriculture, in the way we produce food, all that food waste we talk about, that's got phosphorus in it. You reduce the food waste, you reduce the phosphorus losses too. It's changing diets. And then in the red here, one of the other great things about phosphorus is that unlike nitrogen, which gets lost to the atmosphere and is a potent greenhouse gas, phosphorus kind of stays where it is in water or organic material like soil and manure. So this means if we're smart, we can recover and reuse all of that phosphorus in our food waste, in our wastewater, in the manure, in crop residues. And so that's where we're going to get really smart, I think, in the future. And we need to make sure, we don't have the luxury of time, so we need to make sure that the solutions we're looking for are transformative. We're not looking for little tweaks in the system. We want to make sure that it crosses all scales, not just fantastic local solutions, but these have to be planetary solutions. These have to be national solutions. And also to make sure they cross sectors. We need farmers on board, but we also need supermarkets and food consumers and fertiliser companies and everyone in between. And we also need to be seeking co-benefits. So what I mean by that is we're not just trying to address water pollution or phosphorus security or decarbonising the food system, but we want to be doing all of that and also trying to achieve energy security and restore environments and everything in between where we can. Must be a bit modest. Otherwise, we're not going to meet our SDGs. So what are the specific sort of goals or national priorities in Australia for thinking about a sustainable food and agricultural system? We know we need to decarbonise and we have our net zero targets. We know we need to improve productivity across the economy, but also specifically in agriculture. Productivity has been in decline in terms of both yields, the crop yields that we're getting for the amount of inputs that we're putting in, but also in terms of the economic productivity. That's going to be key, not just to the economy, but to the livelihoods of our farmers and rural businesses and communities. Food security is finally back on the agenda in this country. You may have seen that there was an announcement, a pre-election announcement, and now there's a national food security strategy which is under development in consultation as we speak. It will be very interesting to see what happens there. We need to have a nutrient security in this plan in other countries. We don't yet have that, but we're working on it. I mentioned jobs and livelihoods are incredibly important. We know that. And we also have the Future Made in Australia plan in place to support domestic manufacturing. So a lot of these solutions can also contribute towards local jobs in this country, which also helps buffer against those risky supply chains from overseas. And we also, of course, need to not just protect our environment, but regenerate and restore nature. And finally, public health. We know we have a public health epidemic, and we know that the food system can contribute greatly to improving some of those outcomes, particularly cardiovascular diseases, obesity, etc. So the circular economy is one promising strategy which can help us get towards all of those multiple goals. And you've probably heard about the circular economy. It has three basic fundamental pillars, if you like, which are around minimising waste and pollution, which are around recirculating or keeping the value of products in circulation for as long as possible. So we're not just producing, disposable products. And the third pillar is around restoring nature. There's a lot of work that's been gone on into developing circular economy plans for other sectors. It's been applied a lot less to food and agriculture, but we need to be investing more in that. And we've just finished a really good big project working for the Australian agricultural sector on what would a circular economy look like for Australian agriculture, and what are some of the big roadblocks to scaling it up. And essentially what it's trying to do is say, how can we continue for agriculture and the food system to deliver value and maybe even increase value and the service that it provides, whether that's food security or jobs or soil security, but just decouple that from all of the growing environmental, health and other risks that are happening in the background that we talked about in that blue and green infinity slide. There are many, many different circular opportunities that we can be investing in, and these range widely from things like selling a service instead of a product. And this was made famous, probably 20 years ago by the carpet company Interface, which decided rather than, say if we were standing on carpet here and there was a burn hole in the carpet, rather than having to rip up the whole carpet, roll it up, send it to landfill, which is very bulky and material intensive, if you're leasing carpet, the carpet company would just come and, reinsert a new carpet tile here. So it reduces the material intensity. But we can do that same kind of idea for the food system. For example, fertiliser retailers, rather than just selling fertilisers and their huge environmental burden, could be selling a service like crop productivity or soil health to farmers, so that the farmer gets the outcome that they need in terms of their budgets and their profits and their yields. And it's better for the environment, because then you don't have extra phosphorus and nitrogen going onto that farm and potentially running off, causing algal blooms in the waterway and depleting this finite resource. Then there's, at the other end of the spectrum, there's reuse and recovery options like the anaerobic digestion of manure and food waste to produce bioenergy. And of course, you also, at the end of that, get a very lovely digestate, which can be used as a clean feedstock to produce renewable fertilisers at the same time. And there's a million other opportunities in between. But one of the important things we need to pay attention to here with the circular economy for agriculture is to make sure that the transition is done in coordination with other sectors, because what we're seeing is so much innovation and interest in circular economy in individual sectors, in siloed sectors. But if they don't interlink, then we can end up with situations of technology lock-in or even risk competition for the same organic wastes. And a really good example there is the aviation sector in Australia is really taking this seriously, and they've earmarked a lot of crop residues in Australia's agricultural sector to use as sustainable aviation fuels, because we all want to continue flying and transport things across the globe, and they need to come up with a sustainable fuel. But the problem is, if they take all of that organic residues from farms and use it for energy and for flying, if that is not returned at the end of the day back to the soils in agriculture, we may not be able to continue to grow food, because all of those nutrients, all of that organic matter is essential in the soil to growing crops that we need for food security. And no one's really talking about that. So that's why we really need to make sure we bring sectors together to discuss these issues collaboratively. I also just wanted to share another project we've recently finished called the PACSAN project, and that is about the phosphorus and climate smart agriculture network. And what we were trying to do here, it's a collaborative project with stakeholders across the food system in Australia and also in China, where we were looking at what are the most impactful sustainable measures that can both reduce greenhouse gas emissions across our whole food system, the whole food value chain, and also reduce phosphorus demand or recycle phosphorus. So we wanted to choose those two twin challenges. I was going to show you this really cool interactive model that we've developed, but probably won't have time now, so we can send you the link after. But that's a little snippet screen grab and what from the Decarbonising Australia's Food System. And what it basically shows is all those different rainbow colours of the different sectors along the value chain, from whether it's fertiliser manufacturing, livestock, food retailing, etc. And the dotted line is our business as usual greenhouse gas emissions in the do nothing approach. And then you've got our net zero targets that we want to get 43% and then net zero by 2050 down the bottom. And so you as the user, you could be a stakeholder or the public, anyone can go in and slide any one of these 8 sustainable measures that might be around, increasing electrification to renewable energy away from, gas and diesel, for cold storage and, tractors on farm use, or creating renewable fertilisers. You can slide that opportunity from 0 to 100 and watch that curve bend down. So it's almost like a game for trying to meet net zero. So it's a way to get a conversation started between stakeholders about what combination or portfolio of sustainable measures do we need to meet net zero in agriculture and the whole food system. The 8 measures that we looked at, won't go through them all, but the first one was around renewable fertilisers. And by that I mean for nitrogen, you would be using renewable hydrogen instead of natural gas to produce ammonia. So ammonia is one of the critical intermediate resources that's required to produce fertilisers. It's nitrogen-based, but it produces an awful lot of nitrous oxides, a really potent greenhouse gas. And on the phosphorus side, we want to be recovering all of that organic material we talked about in food waste and wastewater to produce those renewable fertilisers. But we can also do things like improve nutrient productivity on farm. So there's a lot of ways we can tap into the phosphorus that's already locked up in the soil rather than continually applying new fertilisers. We can sequester carbon into soils. We can look at crop types that are better in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We know that traditional rice production, well, not traditional, conventional rice production is a huge greenhouse gas emitter, but there are other crop varieties, or, globally we talk about sorghum and millet being, really good sustainable crop varieties. And we can also, and Australia has been looking a lot at livestock feed additives based on Sphaerogopsis algae to reduce the fermentation in their gut and hence burping out methane. I mentioned energy productivity like electrification, and then 7 are sustainable food choices. So how can we shift from our overconsumption of animal proteins towards more plant-based consumption? And 8 is food waste avoidance. We know that's a really big one. So what we saw, and this is very high-level modelling, what we found for those 8 different measures that I mentioned in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, what is the potential over the next 25 years until we get to our net zero target of 2050? What's the potential? And you can see the biggest ones here are around sustainable food choices and livestock feed additives and energy productivity. And that's a bit too small to see, but what we also did is we wanted to see across the food value chain, the different sectors, which are the sectors that are actually going to have to be implementing these changes. So you can see for some it's mainly a single sector, whereas for energy productivity, we're going to need the collaboration to electrify with a whole bunch of different sectors, including the transport sector. Zooming in on diets, we know that Australia actually has the highest per capita greenhouse gas emissions for our diets compared to other G20 countries. And you can see Australia at the very top, and the dark blue is our current emissions from our current diet. And the lighter blue bar there next for the Australia at the top shows that if we were actually following the national dietary guidelines, which is a little bit healthier than what we currently eat, let's admit it, we would actually be dramatically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions at the same time. And even further than that, you might not be able to see this red dotted line here. If we were to live within the safe operating space of humanity within this planetary boundary, we would need to reduce our emissions even more through changed diets. And I'll come to that again. Back to phosphorus, in terms of what this project and the analysis showed were the major opportunities in the next 2.5 decades to reduce phosphorus demand and provide supply for renewable fertilisers. We found that the number one measure, again, was sustainable food choices, in addition to nutrient productivity, reducing food waste. This is on the demand side. And on the supply side, there's huge potential in Australia to tap phosphorus in manure, in our crop waste, our food waste, and our human excreta. We also know that, like with greenhouse gas emissions, the Australian diet also comes out number one in terms of the biggest phosphorus footprint per capita. What the phosphorus footprint means, it's a bit like, energy footprint, water footprint. It's the amount of phosphate or phosphorus that was mined in, say, China or Morocco to sustain our diets for 1 year, each of our diets. And in that bar, you can see that the dark blue refers to our meat, dairy and eggs consumption, whereas the light blue refers to vegetable consumption. So what it shows is that the phosphorus footprint of our diets is very much linked to our animal protein consumption as well. So now we're just going to dive a little bit deeper into two of our examples, starting off with renewable fertilisers. And we're going to talk a little bit about stacked benefits, because we talked earlier about we need to look for co-benefits. So what are the other benefits here? And this is really important for communicating with policymakers and businesses about what are the whole suite of benefits that when you stack them up, it's quite overwhelming and exciting. You can see all of these opportunities once you put it together. Because I think that's also the tricky challenge about a lot of these solutions, is that the costs or the problem doesn't just occur in one sector, it crosses sectors, but it also means that the opportunities cross sectors too. So we need to look at how we can co-invest in these kinds of things. So I've already mentioned what our definition of renewable fertilisers is, and there's huge benefits for food security, because if we're producing these in Australia, for example, from domestic organic wastes, we can buffer against those fertiliser price spikes that we talked about, the 400% price spikes 2 years ago, the 800% price spikes that we saw in 2008, and we can reduce our dependence on risky import markets, because we are still very dependent on imports, even though we produce some phosphate rock here as well. And this can provide security for farmers in terms of fertiliser supplies, which they need every year. And all of that organic matter is fantastic for soil health and can have huge benefits in terms of, for example, retaining moisture in the soil, which is great in terms of more climate resilient soils and agriculture in the face of, say, droughts. We also know that there's many benefits for water security, first in terms of reducing nutrient pollution of our waterways, because we know that one of those planetary boundaries about phosphorus is exceeding the safe operating space, largely because there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen coming out of our, as I mentioned, wastewater, and also agriculture, causing that really widespread nutrient pollution. And so if we're recovering all those nutrients from wastewater and agriculture before they get to our waterways, it's going to have huge environmental benefits there. And it can also improve the wastewater treatment process. Sorry, I have a little fly. It can also improve our climate resilience, because we know that the greenhouse gas impact of nitrogen fertilisers is about 5% of total global emissions, which is huge in terms of producing fertilisers but also using them. And reduce organic waste like food waste to landfill if we're reusing it instead, so it doesn't have that potent methane generation that's happening in landfill, in addition to help sequestering carbon. And there's a huge range of other benefits. We won't go into to all of those now. And the second example is the stacked benefits associated with shifting to more sustainable diets. So there's this planetary health diet, which was developed by a collaborative initiative called the Eat Lancet Commission over the past 5 or more years. And essentially it shows that regardless of the region of the world we're talking about, we all need to shift our diets towards more fresh vegetables, away from more starchy vegetables, towards more complex grains, more plant proteins, etc. You get the picture. So huge benefits for the environment. We know it can dramatically reduce our water, energy footprints, phosphorus footprints, reduce land use and hence deforestation and contribute to increasing biodiversity again. Massive public health benefits for addressing the disease burden related to diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and the cancer risks that we've heard about in the past 5 or 10 years related to processed red meats, and also those zoonotic risks we talked about, and also including things like salmonella as well, because food safety would be issues would be improved, food risks reduced, and the antimicrobial resistance risks. And then, of course, if you're reducing that disease burden as well at those top bullet points, then you're reducing healthcare costs, because the current healthcare costs are absolutely profound related to these diseases, which are very much related to our current diet, in addition to our lifestyles, of course. Huge benefits for climate resilience, particularly around methane emissions we talked about from food waste, but also livestock and manure emissions, the reduced nitrous oxide emissions from the extra fertilisers that wouldn't be required, and reduced carbon dioxide emissions from the extra cold storage, processing, transport that would be avoided as well. Not to mention the equity and welfare benefits we might see for both animals and for us in terms of social equity, because some of these foods are likely to be more accessible, more affordable. So just coming to the very end, we talk a lot about these really big, exciting ideas, but at the Institute for Sustainable Futures, when we're working closely with stakeholders who want to implement some of these things, we want to talk about, how ready are these opportunities to transform. So here's just an example of a framework for assessing transformational readiness. We talk a lot about technology readiness. There's a scale from 1 to 9 of whether a technology is still in the lab under development. Is it being prototyped? Is it fully commercialised? Why can't we do the same thing for all of these other categories? We need to know, is the market ready? And going back to our example of renewable fertilisers, in a circular economy, we need to be thinking not with a waste management paradigm that we're trying to just prevent all that waste from polluting waterways or releasing greenhouse gas emissions, but if we want it to be reused, then we actually might need to start with the market, identify our target end users. So is this indoor tomato growers? Is it broadacre, corn growers who might use these products? What fertilisers do they currently use? They use pellets, liquid, sludge. What machinery do they currently use? Are they already invested in? How much do they pay? At what price point might they shift to a new product? What are their current sort of preferences and priorities and limitations? What can they do to still sell to Coles and Woolworths? Because obviously they wouldn't want to use a product that they can't, that would prevent them from selling. So we need to think about all of that first, and then go back to our waste sources, our food waste and our sewage, and say, well, what technologies can we use to treat this waste, to convert it into a product that will meet our end users' needs? So that's really important. We need to start at that end. And we also need to think about stakeholder readiness. So are stakeholders ready to transform? Are they aware of these issues? Are they motivated to change? Are they already taking action? And we did a recent study to assess farmers and rural businesses' readiness or appetite to change towards circular economy practices. And what we found for those that were surveyed is that they were aware and they were motivated, but a lot of them weren't taking action, and that's because things were the barriers were outside of their sphere of control. It wasn't something that they could easily do. The barriers were systemic barriers beyond their control, like regulatory fragmentation across states between Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland, or a lack of financing. A small and medium-sized farmer can't afford, $1.5 million capital cost to put a biogas digester on site. But who else might be able to co-finance that? And that's when we also get to financial readiness. Because I mentioned the benefits cross different sectors. So how can that be a co-financing model? Or how can the government provide incentives or tax breaks, or philanthropic support or private equity? And how can we share those risks? And coming to the end, the workforce readiness. This is with any transition, we need to think about what skills do we need in this country and what capacity do we already have? Are we going to be importing skilled labour from overseas to deliver, or do we need to start thinking about our education and training pipeline now within TAFE, within universities, within others, and how long is that? So that's really important for any transition. And finally, knowledge readiness. Do we have the knowledge to be able to support evidence-based decisions? And obviously that's where, we all come into play at universities and other research institutes. Incredibly important. So just some very final take-home messages. The food system is under pressure. I think we all know that. It's pretty serious. The path we're on is not okay, and we need to change that in big transformational ways. And there's many opportunities, from decarbonising to circularising, but we do need to look for those co-benefits. Some of the biggest the levers of change to decarbonise are related to food waste and shifting our diets. And so we need to talk about what would a climate-smart planetary diet look like in this country, and how do we get there? For phosphorus security, still not on the agenda, but it needs to be. But it can be tackled with a circular economy, with opportunities like renewable fertilisers, in addition to as well shifting to more plant-based diets. But we need to bring all sectors together to collaborate and coordinate this transformational change with the food sector, the energy sector, environment, transport, trade, all of it, in order to transform. So I will leave it there, and I hope that was a bit of food for thought, and I look forward to any questions if we have any time left.